But we start with the ever-strengthening drumbeat of a possible fall federal election. The Trudeau government is accusing the opposition of obstructing the passage of key pieces of legislation. The opposition parties are arguing that that's just how a minority parliament works. Joining me now are three MPs from the different parties. Kevin Lamoureux is the parliamentary secretary to the president of the Privy Council, and he's a Liberal MP for Winnipeg North. Blake Richards is the Conservative Party whip and the MP for the Alberta riding of Banff-Airdrie, and Rachel Blaney is the NDP whip and member for the BC riding of Powell River North Island. All three of you, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, Kevin Lamoureux, I'm going to ask the question that everyone's asking. Are we headed inevitably for a fall election?
Well, you know, I'm going to stick to what the Prime Minister says and other members of my caucus. Our focus continues to be the pandemic and bringing forward legislation that's necessary in order to get us through this. There's also some very progressive legislation that we're hoping to be able to pass. I know that the opposition parties spend a great deal of time speculating on the election. For us, we want to continue to get us through the pandemic.
Okay, so let's walk through some things that we did learn this week. Your House Leader, Paolo Rodriguez, has identified at least 4 priority bills that he says your government needs to get passed. One is an obvious one, the Budget Implementation Bill. Then there's the bill to ban conversion therapy, Bill C6. There's an environmental framework or an accountability bill, a net zero bill, C12. And there's also the bill on public broadcasting, Bill C10. He's identified all 4 of those as priorities. When will your Liberal government draw the line and say, these aren't coming, they're not going to pass, it's time for an election? Do you have to get all 4 of them passed? What's the trade-off here?
Well, we're not going to give up. All 4 of these pieces of legislation are absolutely essential. The budget one is the most obvious. The other 3 pieces, whether it's the net zero on the environment or the conversion therapy or the broadcasting, the modernization of broadcasting over 30 years in need, these are very important progressive pieces of legislation. And because of the destructive force from the Conservative Party on the floor of the House of Commons, they're going out of their way to prevent anything from passing. So we're going to look to our progressive partners that are prepared to assist us in recognizing the value of this legislation and try to get it passed. That's the reason why we attempted to bring forward a motion to get extended hours, which will come to a vote next week. We're not scared to put in the hours that are necessary in order to do this work for Canadians.
Okay, Blake Richards, on behalf of the Conservatives, it's sort of a double-barrel question. One, you're being accused of obstructing, but 2, when you look at these 4 priority pieces of legislation that the government has earmarked, we just mentioned, when you look at 2 of them, Bill C6, banning conversion therapy, and Bill C12 on a net zero environmental accountability framework, a very important bill, are you concerned that if they don't pass, you're giving the government something to hammer you over the head with if they call an election? They can then point to something very important in terms of the social values and accuse you of being social conservatives, and something important on the environment and accuse you of being anti-environment. These are systematically chosen to make it difficult.
Well, I guess I'd give a 2-part answer to that, Martin. First of all, you know, any trouble the government is having getting their legislation passed is of their own making. I know they want to try to find ways to blame it on others. But, you know, Parliament is designed to make sure that bills are scrutinized, to make sure that there is proper debate. And that debate happens in 2 different ways. It happens in the House of Commons, but it also happens in the parliamentary committees. And as many people know, the Liberals have been filibustering in a number of committees for months now. And they're holding up the ability for those committees to do their work. So, you know, if they want to point the fingers at somebody, they should point the fingers at themselves. Their legislation could be getting through if they had not prorogued Parliament, if they had not filibustered at all these parliamentary committees. So if they want to blame anyone, they should blame themselves. We will continue to do our jobs to make sure that we bring forward the points that Canadians want us to bring forward. No one wants to obstruct anything from happening. I mean, we want to look at bills and determine whether they're good legislation, bad legislation, and we'll make decisions on how we vote, and et cetera, on those things. But at the end of the day, if the government wants to point fingers at anyone here, they need to point the fingers at themselves.
Okay, Rachel Blaney, I want to ask you, what do you make of the government's prioritization of these 4 bills and the state of affairs with the opposition being accused of obstructing?
Well, it is extremely frustrating. These are some very important bills, especially when I look at things like having the environmental framework in place. The NDP worked really hard to get it to be a little bit better. So we want to see these things passed. Quite honestly, though, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. We've seen both the Conservatives and the Liberals filibustering in different committees, causing these challenges. We need to get work done because Canadians are asking us to get this work done. So what I hope to see is more of a collaborative attitude, but it's sort of one of these challenges because we've got the Liberals saying, oh, we're not saying that there's going to be an election in the fall, but we're doing everything we can to prepare for an election in the fall, including pushing this legislation through. And then we have the Conservatives disrupting again and again. We need to get the work done. That is why we are here. One of the things that is good about minority governments is that there's multiple levels of power and collaboration, which allows, I think, for more fair processes and legislation that reflects Canadians better. So I hope that there isn't an election in the fall. COVID, of course, has taken a huge toll on our communities. I don't think this is a good time to be tossing that on top of everything else. When I look at the tourism industry in my riding, for example, we really just need to support them so that they're still here when this is done. Having an election is not helpful.
Okay, Kevin Lamoureux, I guess the ultimate argument that comes from the opposition parties is that there should be no rush to this, in the sense that if your government, it will be your government that will cause this legislation to die on the order paper if you call an election. That the debate and the rush into the debate of these priority pieces of legislation all could be done at a good pace, but if things don't get finished, you can be back to it in the first week of September or whenever you come back in September, that you're looking for a pretext to call an election.
Well, I don't buy into that because at the end of the day, you don't have an option when it comes to Bill C-30. And let's use Bill C-30, a tangible example. Yesterday, we were supposed to be debating Bill C-30. Instead, the first thing the Conservatives do is they move an adjournment motion to prevent, with the idea of stopping the House for the day, causing votes and bells and so forth. And then we have to go to orders of the day. The Conservatives then stand up on privilege issues and argue endlessly on matters that are not based on privilege. And at the end of the day, every hour that is used up through their games, that destructive force, we lose the opportunity to have members then speak on the legislation. And then the Conservatives will criticize us for not allowing them to have enough members to speak on the legislation. They're being hypocritical. The excuses that Mr. Richard has given is very lame at best. There is a great deal of frustration because the government genuinely wants to see this important legislation passed before the House rises. It is nothing outside the norm.
Okay, but I just right. But I want to interrupt. I mean, just in 2 words, though. One thing is for sure, you're going to have extended hours next week. So for the next eight days, you're going to have 8 days to go. Extended hours in the evenings once you decide on it on Monday. The C-30, granted, the budget implementation bill has to be passed, as do the supplementary estimates. But all of these other pieces of legislation can be debated at a regular pace and get to them and try and finish them, but it's this axe hanging over the head of everything in terms of a potential election.
If you go to previous parliaments, you'll see that all legislation doesn't pass at the end of a particular mandate.
Yeah.
This is important pieces of legislation in which we have declared that. We've been talking about it for a long time now. We expect and we're hopeful that we'll get support at least from progressive-minded parties to see it ultimately pass before summer breaks.
Okay, I want to ask Blake Richards. Richards, you've been both sides, both the NDP and the Liberals are accusing you of, in a way, playing into the government's hand, of being, when you delay and when you are allegedly obstructive, that you're playing into the government's hand. You're feeding their narrative of a necessary election.
Well, I think what strikes me here is, like, we're trying to make sure that the parliamentary committees can do the work that they're there to do. And we've seen this systematic Liberal filibustering to try to cover up things, and then even to cover up the cover-ups in some cases. And, Mr. Lamoureux calls that lame. Well, I frankly will say that Canadians expect the parliamentary committees to be able to do their work. Their tactics they've been using here caused the cancellation of committees.
Okay.
For example, we had a committee that was bringing in Indigenous business owners to talk about some of the problems that they have with government programs.
Okay,
so
last
is it
question.
lame that Indigenous business owners wanted to come in and talk about their problems with the government? New immigrants was another committee that they canceled,
Okay,
where they wanted to come in and talk about some
last
issues
question.
with the government. Is that lame? I don't think that's lame at all. I mean, this government has the ability to allow Parliament to work if it wants to. It also has the time to pass these things if it would just stop filibustering.
Okay. Rachel, are you worried that Canadians will forget once the election has been called? They'll forget about being angry about an election being called?
Well, all I have to say is there are some major concerns. For example, today in the House of Commons, I brought up the reality that with Bill C-30, what we're going to see is Canadians that are receiving the CRB are going to be getting $800 less a month. We are in the middle of a pandemic. We have hopeful horizon, but we need to make sure that families are okay during this time. So to have an election, because people are making, both sides, the Liberals and the Conservatives, making all these political mandates, these dramas, we need to get to work for Canadians.
Okay, I want to thank all three of you for your time. Thanks for joining us.